This episode is brought to you by Amazon Prime. There's nothing sweeter than baking cookies during the holidays. With Prime, I get all my ingredients delivered right to my door, fast and free, no last-minute store trips needed. And of course, I blast my favorite holiday playlist on Amazon Music. It's the ultimate soundtrack for creating unforgettable memories. From streaming to shopping, it's on Prime. Visit Amazon.com/Prime to get more out of whatever you're into.
How would you like a 15% discount to my daily email, the stack of stuff, the show notes, discounts to the conference, all of that? All you need to do is text the word show to 33777. You'll get the annual subscription with a 15% discount to my daily email. You'll get the stack of stuff, the links to the show notes, discounts to the conference, and so much more. All you have to do is text the word show, SHOW, to 33777. Text show to 33777.
Welcome to the Eric Erickson Show podcast, Hour 3.
Hello, America. Welcome. It's Eric Erickson here across the United States. Glad to have you with me. The phone number, if you want to be on the program today, 877-973-7425. As always, you can text Eric, E-R-I-C-K, to 33777. Should you wish to be on the program, I would be happy to have you. We got a lot of moving pieces happening right now on the program. I want to make sure that I bring you up to speed on everything, and we should begin now. We have the name of the individual identified by police as a person of interest in the shooting of Brian Thompson, the CEO. His name is Luigi. Wonder if his brother's Mario. Luigi was at McDonald's apparently jumping up and down trying to jump over mushrooms on the floor. Luigi Mangione from Townsend, Maryland, 26 years old. He's been taken into custody at the Altoona, Pennsylvania McDonald's. Apparently says he lived in Hawaii as a tech bro, graduated or was at the University of Pennsylvania, and according to sources with police, had a manifesto railing against the U.S. healthcare industry and in support of climate change. He is a self-described anti-capitalist, of course. Friends, I want to go back to something I wrote in November of 2021. Nicole Hannah-Jones is a Pulitzer Prize winner. She came up with the 1619 Project for the New York Times, and she said, this is her quote. It's a direct quote from her. Destroying property which can be replaced is not violence. They were beginning at the time to justify violence by doing what the left always does, changing words, by saying it's not violence. Violence is not violence. If something can be replaced, it's not violence. Killing someone is violence until that person can be replaced, and then it's not violence. You see, this is where we're headed. I have regularly condemned the actions of individuals on January 6, 2021 for being violent, and there have been those on the right who insisted there was no violence. But what I find is the mirror image on the left, where you see cities in this country burning down and property destruction, and they say it's not really violence. I mean, according to Nicole Hannah-Jones, January 6th could not have been violent because destroying property which can be replaced is not violent. It's not violence. See these twisting of justifications there. You can't say, if you believe that destroying property is not violence, well, January 6th was not violent. On November 17th, 2021, Jonah Goldberg at the Dispatch wrote this. You need to pay attention to this quote. There were the days when the militant left wasn't dedicated merely to blowing up binary gender categories with tweeted truth bombs, but to blowing up buildings and occasionally people with real bombs. During the summer of 1970 alone, there were 20 bombings a week in California. Quote, "It's a wonderful feeling to hit a pig. It must be a really wonderful feeling to kill a pig or blow up a building," said Mark Rudd of the Weather Underground. Jane Fonda held F the Army rallies in 1972, let herself be used as an enemy or a propaganda tool for the North Vietnamese, even posing behind the trigger of a North Vietnamese anti-aircraft gun. The Black Panthers made Black Lives Matter look like a debating society. As bad as the BLM and Antifa riots of 2020 were, and they were bad, they pale in comparison to riots in the past. In 1971, the Weather Underground bombed the United States Capitol. In 1972, the Weather Underground bombed the Pentagon. In 1975, the Weather Underground bombed the State Department. They plotted the assassination of a California state senator in 1978. That's only one violent left-wing group. There are others. In the last few decades, the Earth Liberation Front has engaged in numerous terrorist acts in the nation. They have burned down research facilities and destroyed violence. Ted Kaczynski was a lunatic radical of the left, the Unabomber. According to a 2001 report, quote, "Left-wing extremism is responsible for 3/4 of designated acts of terrorism in the United States in the 1980s. By the way, they also have something else in common. Left-wing terrorists tend to be younger and better educated than right-wing extremists, and they tend to live in urban areas, making high population centers target-rich. The source for that is the paper with the Office of Scientific and Technical Information of the United States government. Left-wing extremism often has developed from working-class movements seeking in theory to eliminate, not preserve, class distinctions. Communism evolved from left-wing extremism. The threat from left-wing extremism did not die with the threat of the Soviet Union, however. Domestic groups and state-sponsored cells and individuals have continued their espionage activities and planning of terrorist actions in the United States. Leftist extremists were responsible for 3/4 of officially designated terrorist acts in the 1980s. From an international perspective, of the 13,858 people who died between 1988 and 1998 in acts committed by the 10 most active terrorist groups in the world, 74% were killed by leftist organizations. Although the current domestic terror threat within the United States is focused on right-wing extremists and white supremacists, left-wing extremists are alive and well and have several objectives. Some of these groups want to replace the government with a Marxist-Leninist system. Others want to carve out a new nation in the southeast United States where the national territory of Kush would be established. Some of the leaders of these movements are political exiles in Cuba. Many of them are in the United States as well. Left-wing extremists pose an espionage threat to the United States as well. And again, they tend to be more educated and wealthier than their right-wing counterparts. This, by the way, was prepared for the United States Department of Energy Office of Safeguards and Security in Washington, D.C. in April of 2001, before the September 11th attacks. Luigi Mangione appears to fit the bill. He graduated as valedictorian from a prep school with a $40,000 a year tuition. He hated the medical community because of his complaints, he said, of what they did to family members. His LinkedIn page says he once worked in an assisted living facility for the elderly. Mangione's account on Goodreads shows quotes he particularly liked, ranging from Socrates to Bruce Lee to Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. Imagine a society that subjects people to conditions that make them terribly unhappy, then gives them the drugs to take away their unhappiness, Kaczynski wrote. Science fiction is already happening to some extent in our own society. Instead of removing the conditions that make people depressed, modern societies give them antidepressant drugs. In effect, antidepressants are a means of modifying an individual's internal state in such a way as to enable him to tolerate social conditions he would otherwise find intolerable. He was a valedictorian in 2016 from his high school where he played soccer. Tuition was $40,000 a year. Then he went to the University of Pennsylvania to study computer science and cognitive science. He worked for a tech company in California, but said he lived in Honolulu, Hawaii. He was a data engineer. Y'all, I've been telling you for quite a while that progressives are turning violent again. There's always been a strange strain of violence. And what's happened now, notably, is in the last few years, you've had a lot of people with online energy rationalizing the violence against Brian Thompson. People hate insurance companies. This is a natural impact of it. This is natural flow of it. No, there's nothing natural about taking a human life. If there is something natural about it, then we should not have laws against murder because it's natural. But it's not just this guy. And again, alleged suspect now. The home of the University of Michigan Regent Jordan Acker has been vandalized in Huntington Woods, Michigan. The attack involved the throwing of mason jars through windows and spray painting the family SUV with pro-Palestine messages. This is the third attack against this man since October 7th. He is Jewish. He has faced harassment linked to his public role on the University of Michigan's Board of Regents. Democrats aren't being very loud about this. But wait, there is more. George Mason University Students for Justice in Palestine co-president has been looked at. Court documents, which do not publicly indicate a reason for a search of this person's home, allege that authorities found guns and magazines inside the home. Materials authorities say belong to the father and brother of the George Mason students. Note, those of you in Rio Linda, the magazines are gun magazines, not like printed pages. Police allege that Hamas and Hezbollah flags were found, according to an emergency petition filed to temporarily prohibit the men from possessing or buying firearms. Prosecutors later said during a hearing authorities found 4 weapons unsecured in the home, along with more than 20 magazines with 30 bullets each. According to Laura Birnbaum, a spokesman for Fairfax County Commonwealth's attorney, also found were arm patches with Arabic text that was translated in court to read, "Kill them where they stand," and other patches that call for the death of Jews and America. Prosecutors argued that the high volume of weapons and ammunition, along with specific threats, pose a reasonable danger to others. So you've got Luigi Mangione, who is now supposedly alleged to be the shooter of Brian Thompson. The left has justified killing insurance company executives. He apparently is a climate change nut and also hates capitalism. You have the left-wing Students for Justice in Palestine stockpiling ammo, has an arm patches with Arabic writing that says "Kill them where they stand," who wants to eliminate Jews and the United States. The University of Michigan, you have an anti-Semitic attack on the regent of the University of Michigan. You have the New York Times singing the praises of a book about blowing up oil and gas pipelines in this country. The left is turning violent. They've lost the election. And in losing the election, they're not having a normal one. For the last 4 years, Democrats and members of the press have been warning about the rise of right-wing terrorism in this country. Yet, Floyd Lee Corkins, who shot up the Family Research Center, was a progressive activist. James Hodgkinson was a progressive Rachel Maddow viewer who wanted to assassinate Republican members of Congress. 2 separate individuals wanted to assassinate Donald Trump, one of whom got a shot off. We've had multiple progressive anti-Semitic protesters on college campuses around this country. Now you've got this guy who murdered a husband and father of two because he's outraged his insurance companies. They're all people on the left, and the left keeps finding ways to excuse the violence and explain and rationalize the violence. And you will notice that when this happens, it happens to be, God forbid, someone from the right, people on the right stand up and say, this is not acceptable. On the left, they stand up and say, this isn't acceptable, but. It's always the but that fires the bullets. If you're just tuning in here across America, the name of the suspect is Luigi Mangione. Yeah, boy, the internet is having a field day with this, I will tell you. It appears this guy, though, is very much on the left, an anti-capitalist, environmentalist who hates insurance companies and believes that they are, quote unquote, parasites. Now, here's the thing, and this is a very simple point that needs to be made. People on the left have been justifying the murder of this father and husband because he worked for a company they view as bad, and therefore he was bad. And when you begin to do that, you begin to otherize. And I want you to consider how many people were upset when Donald Trump used words like parasite to talk about illegal aliens, and none of those people are going to be upset that this guy used that word to talk about an insurance company CEO and people in insurance. It is historically a pattern on the left that they otherize people and exterminate people. Mao, Pol Pot, Lenin, Stalin. They can say that Hitler was right-wing, but Hitler was actually a National Socialist who wanted universal health care and imposed vegetarianism on the Nazi people, very much in line with the left. The left, its eschatology is we have nowhere else to go, and anyone who's ruining this world is bringing hell to earth, and they must be eliminated. And when you have that ideology, when you have that eschatology, it leads to violence, and this is what's happening here. It is absolutely wild to see the justifications for violence happening, and yet they are. And they'll find excuses for this guy. The moral thinking at Hillsdale College would never have people who go off the deep end like this. They are set apart. They are a unique institution and have been since 1844, where they're educating, not indoctrinating, and they teach people to be proudly Americans because of what's set apart and made distinct the United States of America. All you have to do is go to ericforhillsdale.com, ERICK, ericforhillsdale.com. Go sign up with Hillsdale College today. You can get Imprimis. You can get their podcast network. You can get many free courses. Hillsdale College, again, is a great institution that has been setting itself apart from others in this country for quite a while. I really hope you'll go to ericforhillsdale.com today. Check them out, ericforhillsdale.com, ERICK. Sign up for Imprimis at least. I actually got my latest copy. The feature piece is from Kevin Roberts of Heritage Foundation. Imprimis comes to your mailbox free of charge. ericforhillsdale.com. Go sign up with them today. Welcome back. It's Eric Erickson here. The phone number, 877-973-7425. If you want to be on the program, delighted to have you. I will tell you that in looking into this Joey Mangione guy, his views are complex. He has tweeted a bunch of stuff about being anti-woke. He's tweeted a bunch, or he has written a bunch of stuff about hating capitalism. Do we describe him as Bernie bro or something? He's crazy, murderer. How about that? You know, here's one of the problems with the age we live in. So much of our society now is programmed to go for deeper context. So this guy, according to the reports of his manifesto stuff, he was anti-capitalist, he was environmentalist, but he hated the wokes. Everybody wants to pigeonhole him now, left wing, right wing. He definitely appears to lean left in his socioeconomic views, but he doesn't like the wokes. So the progressives will say, well, if he doesn't like the wokes, he must be right oriented. He's in tech. But who is this guy? Allegedly, he murdered a husband and father and was able to rationalize in his head that the man was a parasite. The larger issue here is this, is that there are people who will otherize those they disagree with. And in so doing, they can view people in such a way as to think they're not really human. They're not really us. That's a dangerous thing. I need you to follow along with me in something, and this is somewhat repetitious, because I know I have said this multiple times, but I really need to say it again. But before I do, I just want to read for you a little bit of Charles Cook at National Review. This is from Charles Cook, posted right when the show went live at noon today. The murder of Brian Thompson, the late CEO of United Healthcare, has been met in certain quarters with two disgraceful responses, one explicitly grotesque, the other implicitly so. The explicitly grotesque response has been to openly cheer Thompson's death on the grounds that he deserved to die. This reaction has come largely from figures on social media who believe themselves to be proto-revolutionaries. The implicitly grotesque response has been to declare that one is against assassination, but that one comprehends it and perhaps even sympathizes with it nonetheless. This reaction has been more broadly on display than the other, having appeared in established outlets such as CNN, CBS, and the New York Times, as well as in the Twitter feeds of academics at Columbia and elsewhere. Within the mainstream press, only the Washington Post has found the decency to condemn the killing without reservation. There is no justification, the paper's editorial board submitted this week, for taking a life in this manner. So obvious ought the presumption to be that one should feel dirty for developing the thought any further. To ask why a human being was murdered in cold blood is to imply that there exists a sufficient reason for the act. There does not, and I have no interest in negotiating with those who disagree. What I will do, however, is attempt to convey to those figures exactly why their reactions are so iniquitous and so misplaced, and indeed why condemnation of it is the prerequisite to a functioning civil society. The Post concludes its excellent rejoinder by observing, quote, "This violent attack on one man is really an attack on society itself." That is correct. Why? Well, because everyone has grievances, and there is nothing within our social compact that permits a small subset of them to exempt themselves from its elementary standards. In other countries, where some or all of the medical system has been socialized, it is politicians rather than private insurers who deny or delay or ration health care. Were Americans to adopt such a system, there would remain many Brian Thompsons, but instead of being called CEO, they would be called Senator, Representative, Director of Health and Human Services, or the like. To establish the principle that one may take revenge against anyone who is obliged to deal with scarcity would be to greenlight the routine assassination of the elected or appointed officials who would take responsibility in an altered status quo. Is that what we want? Those who have committed themselves to the maximalist defense of Thompson's killing would presumably either respond yes to the inquiry or make some specious distinction based on their misunderstanding of the profit margin. The weaker apologists, by contrast, will shrink back into their chairs, but they too ought to engage in some self-reflection, for it seems extremely obvious that, were the circumstances different, they would not have got as close as they did to making excuses for the worst of all crimes. The New York Times, in particular, has been keen to inform its readers about the hate, anger, frustration, and rage against health insurance providers that supposedly exists abroad in the land. If pushed to explain this tack, its editors would likely claim that the paper is merely stating a fact. But surely one cannot imagine that this approach would have been taken if Brian Thompson had been the CEO of, say, ABC News. Well, unlike with health insurance, it is an indisputable fact that a supermajority of Americans hate the legacy media and that a minority of Americans express anger, frustration, and rage towards it. Do we really think that following the killing of a prominent media executives, the New York Times would have commissioned a series of indulgent pieces pointing to the legitimate feelings that culminated in an illegitimate act? Or do we think that in such circumstance, the Times would have recognized the evil inherent in adopting the perspective and instead reminded their readers that even the most disdained human beings do not deserve to be killed? That's Charles Cook at National Review. Here's my point. In the history of mankind, the progressive vision of heaven and hell is on earth because there is no heaven and there is no hell. They are atheist in their thinking. So we ourselves, human beings, make heaven or hell. And the pattern on the left and left-wing thinking is this. People get otherized. If you are an environmentalist and you wish to bring heaven to earth, the person who drives the SUV is bringing hell to earth. And you must either structure a system of government in which they are deprived of the ability to purchase an SUV, or you must eliminate them from the gene pool. If you are a communist who believes that the capitalists are bad and the capitalists keep finding ways to make money, you must either eradicate capitalism or eradicate the people who keep making the money. You label them bourgeois and tell people they are bad. Society turns against them and they are shut down, eliminated, and oftentimes murdered. The sort of thinking that apprise collectivist frames, we are all parts of groups, we are all parts of categories, we are not individuals created in the image of God. It's creeping on the right too. You're having it happen to people on the right, the woke right. There are progressives on the left and progressives on the right. We might as well be mindful of it. It's dangerous. Whether you like insurance companies or not, Brian Thompson was a human being made in the image of God. He had a wife and he had 2 sons. And he's murdered by someone who decided that Brian Thompson was not a man, not a father, not a husband, but a parasite. We've just gone through an election cycle where the very same voices finding ways to excuse the murder of Brian Thompson were outraged by Donald Trump using phrases they said harkened back to Nazi Germany when he talked about immigrants and immigration. Now they're trying to find excuses. I got to tell you, right and wrong cannot be tribal. Right and wrong cannot be tribal. And that's part of the problem. And it gets to something that Tim Keller has written about in the past. The late theologian Tim Keller wrote a book, and the book was called The Reason for God. And Keller was actually quoting someone else in the book. And he was talking about the great Says Who. Who comes up with the idea? Who comes up with the idea of morality? Is it the tribe? If so, it's all reflective. It's Arthur Leff. This is what Arthur Leff wrote. When would it be impermissible to make the formal intellectual equivalent of what is known in bar rooms and schoolrooms as the grand Says Who? In the absence of God, each ethical and legal system will be differentiated by the answer it chooses to give to one key question: who among us ought to be able to declare law that ought to be obeyed? Stated that baldly, the question is so intellectually unsettling that one would expect to find a noticeable number of legal and ethical thinkers trying not to come to grips with it. Either God exists or he does not. But if he does not, nothing and no one else can take his place. If there is no God, there is no way to say any one action is moral and another immoral, but only I like this. If that is the case, who gets the right to put their subjective, arbitrary moral feelings into law? You may say the majority has the right to make the law, but do you mean then that the majority has the right to vote to exterminate a minority? If you say no, that's wrong, then you're back to square one. Who says that the majority has a moral obligation not to kill the minority? Why should your moral convictions be obligatory for those in opposition? Why should your view prevail over the will of the majority? The fact is, says Leff, if there is no God, then all moral statements are arbitrary, all moral valuations are subjective and internal, and there is no external moral standard by which a person's feelings and values are judged. Yet Leff ends the intellectual essay on The Great Says You this way, quote, as things are now, everything is up for grabs. Nevertheless, napalming babies is bad. Starving the poor is wicked. Buying and selling each other is depraved. There is such a thing as evil altogether now. Says who? God help us. Nietzsche understood this, saying, the masses blink and say we are all equal. Man is but man. Before God, we are all equal. Before God, but now God has died. Raymond Gaeta is an atheist thinker. Let me read you what Raymond Gaeta wrote. Only someone who is religious can speak seriously of the sacred. We may say that all human beings are estimably precious, that they are ends in themselves, that they are owed unconditional respect, that they possess inalienable rights, and of course that they possess inalienable dignity. In my judgment, these are ways of trying to say what we feel a need to say when we are estranged from the conceptual resources of God, and we need to say it. Not one of these statements about human beings has the power of the religious way of speaking, that we are sacred because God loves us, his children. Arthur Leff is not simply concluding that there's no basis for human rights without God. He's also pointing out that despite the fact that we can't justify or ground human rights in a world without God, we still know they exist. If they exist, who gave them? And if some higher being gave them, we cannot cheer on an executive being murdered just because we think he did bad or just because we think he worked for a bad company. And yet many people on the left, many people without God, many people like this supposed shooter decided he could be the arbiter of who is a human and who is a parasite and gave him the power to exterminate the parasite. And the left has just condemned Donald Trump for saying things they believe mean he wants to eliminate immigrants as parasites. And yet they're willing to give this guy a pass because he targeted the right parasite. When we descend into society and tribally get to decide who is human and who is parasite, we ourselves open ourselves up to horror. It has happened time and time again, and to see the left doing it in this country is a dangerous warning sign for where we are headed as a country. We should all note that where they want us to go is a very terrible hell on earth. Now, all of this news was sort of breaking and everything else happening this weekend. I was in Salt Lake City, Utah for Americans for Prosperity. Actually spent a lot of time on stage talking about the collapse of Syria, as I did at the beginning of this program, talking about the economic path forward in this country and the leadership we can get from Donald Trump and the Republicans and the wildness of the left trying to make excuses for the murder of a human being in New York. It's all relevant to the show today. It was all on stage Saturday night, almost a preview for the show, with Americans for Prosperity. They've got great teams in chapters across the country. I spoke to the Utah chapter. They were having their annual banquet. Every state has Americans for Prosperity. They'd love to have you on board. Go to americansforprosperity.org/volunteer today. americansforprosperity.org/volunteer. You can sign up with AFP, and you can be an activist in your state. You can learn to go to your local government or state government to advance common sense conservative reforms, or you can just be the most informed person in your circle of friends. In Utah, they were telling me they knocked on tens of thousands of doors in a special election in Utah, and they were able to win it with a pro-market, pro-freedom, pro-family conservative by just being the best trained activists on the ground. They are around the country. You can be a part of it. americansforprosperity.org/volunteer. americansforprosperity.org/volunteer. Now, before I go to break, got to correct myself. Thank you to a listener who caught it. I mentioned earlier Obama beating Bush. Obviously, he didn't beat Bush. It was McCain. I just misspoke, but you all know what I meant. Thanks to the listener for pointing it out so I could correct myself before the show ended today. We'll be right back. So we have what appears to be the release of a manifesto by the just wild shooter. Includes numbers hold power, and these actions reflect this truth. Numerology weaves a mystical thread through the universe, and its application here reveals the deeper significance of the strike. Except it's not real. It's not real. Circulating, but that doesn't appear to be the actual manifesto. It certainly appears from the press reports the police have a manifesto, and it certainly appears that he's anti-capitalist, but people have just blown up this essential admission of guilt and targeting of the healthcare CEO, and they're circulating this manifesto online. But one, it clearly appears to have been a PDF of some kind that looks to be generated by Chat GPT or some such, and probably not actually real. You got to be careful. The story is flying fast. It does appear this guy is some sort of anti-woke progressive, if you will, tech guy. He is alleged to be the shooter, certainly person of interest now. But you got to be careful what you see online out there. A lot of people sent me this link and said, have you read this? Have you read this? Appears to be too good to be true at the moment. This guy's going to be, as a buddy of mine just said, a unique case study for all of us. How about this? How about instead of saying he's on the left or he's on the right, woke or not woke, Bernie bro or not, how about we just say if he's the murderer, he's bad? How about we say he's bad? But can we also say it's the people who broke into the University of Michigan Board of Regents member and wrote divest Palestine is also evil, bad? Can we say people are bad who do terrible things to people that we don't like? Can we say this is bad? Can we acknowledge real right and real wrong? Can we acknowledge something beyond tribalism these days? That's a problem we're headed, and the left is turning violent. We've got to be careful. I do wonder if the person who turned him into McDonald's, well, Donald Trump worked there a few weeks ago.